Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. In today's episode, Shyamala Prega speaks with Jonathan Bloom about conversations with AI. Jonathan Bloom is a senior conversation designer for Google, focusing on the Google Assistant. John was previously the UX research lead for Jibo Incorporated, creator of the same-name social robot. John was also senior voice user interface manager for Nuance Communications, where he sat on Nuance's innovation steering committee. Over his 20-year career, John has designed graphic, speech, and multimodal user interfaces for robots, IVRs, dictation software, cars, and mobile applications. John holds a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology from the New School for Social Research. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to The Future is Spoken. Today I have a very special guest with me, Jonathan Bloom from Google, and Jonathan is a senior conversational designer. And we are going to talk about conversations with AI. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
Doing all right, hanging in there, doing my best.
Yeah, definitely. Jonathan, why don't you tell us about your background and what you do at Google?
Sure. As you said, I'm a senior conversation designer at Google, focusing on the Google Assistant. And I got my starts in this area. Actually, in undergrad, I had to do a experiment for research methods in psychology. And I found it really interesting how people use the phrase "like" all the time, like, and he was like, oh my gosh. And I was fascinated that there was this field where you could study things like how people say like and kind of and sort of and and it was actually a field of study. It wasn't just like stand-up comedy. So I had to go that direction, and I started focusing on psycholinguistics. And I went ahead and got my Ph.D. in the psychology of language. And from there on, I started focusing on the area that was burgeoning at the time of usability engineering. I knew I didn't want to go into academia. So I was trying to figure out, how do I parlay this into an actual job? And my professor at the time, who was my dissertation chair, said, well, there is this field of usability engineering, and you should take a look at that because it's all about the psychology of interacting with machines. And there may be some linguistic questions there. And after an internship at Symantec, by luck, the company Dragon Systems came to Symantec to demo some stuff they were working on. And Joel Gould, who was the presenter from Dragon, I immediately emailed him afterwards and said, is there any need for a usability engineer in the field of dictation software? And he responded quickly, and within a month I was trying to get a job there. And it was weird because I was basically, to get the job, I had to give a presentation and had to call their baby ugly. Like, I was presenting about what was wrong with naturally speaking that could make it more usable. And surprisingly, they were amenable to it. And from there on in, for 20 something years, I've been focusing on usability and conversational systems, going from dictation to a company called at Dragon to SpeechWorks, which was a IVR company that was then purchased by Scansoft. And I don't know if you recall the Scansoft world, but they were this company that was in imaging, and they suddenly started acquiring speech companies. They acquired the one I was at, SpeechWorks. They acquired our competitor Nuance. And then they took Nuance's name, and the Nuance we all know and love today was actually started from that unusual origin. And they took the Dragon Naturally Speaking software too. So everything I worked for, every company I worked for, ended up under the Nuance umbrella. And after many years there, and I went off to a company called Speech Cycle for a little while, came back to Nuance. And after, 15 years of working in the IVR space, I was ready to try something else. I mean, I did get a chance to work with automotive during that time and a little bit of mobile, but it was mostly IVR. I ended up going to Jibo, That was 2016 roughly, and worked in that area, Jibo being the social robot, the brainchild of Cynthia Brazil from MIT Media Labs. Worked there for a couple of years until things didn't go perfectly and needed to look for new work. And lo and behold, there was a role at Google. And here I am today.
That's an incredible journey, and you are a veteran in this space. And we do
Yeah.
have something in common. So I used to work for VoiceBox Technologies, which is now acquired by Nuance. So
Okay.
yeah, we do have the Nuance connection, which is interesting.
Yeah. I think uh, it seems like everything that has been speech at some point has been pulled into the mothership of Nuance. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Jonathan, you specialize in multimodal design and you have an incredible journey from IVR to designing robots, and
Mhm.
then also now designing voice assistants for smart speakers and smartphones and everything. What
Yeah.
kind of similarities and differences do you see designing for one modality versus the other?
Uh, well, the different modalities, when usually when I'm talking about modalities, it's the sort of voice input output versus the visual input output. And I have mostly, to be brutally honest, I am mostly focused on the audio channel, how the audio modality. However, with Jibo and then with the Google Assistant, more and more we're integrating those with the visual modality. I mean, there's the differences mostly are in the use cases, in terms of how or why people would use these things. As I don't know, if your audience's background is in this field, but for those who aren't, the use cases, the number one use case for voice only is eyes free, eyes busy, hands busy. So perfect example is you're driving in the car and someone needs to get something done and they want to be able to do it without having to look at anything ideally. uh, and that's where we focus mostly on voice only. But then now we've got this whole world of multimodal where in the kitchen, for instance, if you have a device in the kitchen and you want to do some sort of kitchen recipes, you want to do food recipes, then you have this opportunity to move in between them as needed. So your hands get covered with flour as you're making a cake or something, or so you want to be able to do something by voice, but every now and then you just have to go look at the directions because you don't want to hear an earful. Uh, I mean, one of the challenges with voice is that it's ephemeral. It goes away immediately after you hear it, and it's serial. You can only get one piece of information at a time. So the screen can be very valuable if you've got a long step in the instructions of the recipe, for instance. So it's the use cases that really make the difference between which modalities we're using. Uh, but yeah, with Jibo, it was interesting because it was a voice forward experience. And by voice forward, I mean that it's still multimodal, but we're leaning more towards the audio channel. But even if people weren't tapping a screen, there was so much visually that we were doing to enhance the experience, not necessarily to give something that was required for the interaction, like in terms of like getting the job done, but in terms of adding a warmth. The screen was able to do that. As he listened, his eye was moving around in a certain way that communicated I'm listening. When he was thinking, his eye might look up like he's thinking about this thing. And notice I'm saying he. Jibo was very compelling. So the screen could be used for a lot of supplemental benefits that may not be considered part of the job or the task at hand, but a larger idea of this thing communicating emotions and feelings and warmth, etc.
Yeah, that's amazing, right? We have options now that you can decide which modality you want to choose and how you want to do, depending on the different use cases and where it has been or being used. So those are great things, right? Do
Yeah.
you also see the multimodal design benefits people who, for more inclusive design rather?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that accessibility is an extremely important topic today, and I think sometimes people think that voice is an accessibility feature, and it can be, absolutely, but we can't use that as an excuse to say, well, we have this voice modality, so therefore we've checked all the accessibility boxes. Absolutely not. So depending on the disability that the person has in their life, we have to be mindful of just more options in terms of modality, not necessarily one being the one that is the accessibility feature. So, with a multimodal device where there's voice input and output, and there's touch input and visual output, there's more opportunities, and it opens it up for a larger audience, to be sure. Just on that point of use cases, one interesting use case that I think earlier on we hadn't really thought about, and I don't know if we'd say use case, but one of the benefits we hadn't really thought about is, when my family's at home and we're on our phones, that we are all in our own world. We are shutting each other out, and we're sort of, looking at the screen, and somebody could be in the room with you. Nobody could be in the room with you. It doesn't really matter because you're in that space. With these devices, we're finding that one of the benefits of them, and one of the benefits of voice specifically, is that it's communal again. It's like sitting around the radio shows, over 50 years ago, where everybody's engaged, everybody's interacting with the same experience. So it's a more shared experience, which has been a nice benefit of this modality. And the use cases are much more communal, and that's been very positive in our household. I mean, sometimes positive, but then my son will walk into the office when I'm working and just say, "Hey, Google, play Nickelback," and then run out of the room, and then then I have to listen to a band I don't like. But usually, there's a lot of value in it, and it's a very again, using the theme of warmth, brings more people together.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, who actually use assistants for pranking others, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, okay, play this goofy or like scary music at midnight or something like that. Which is kind of cool, right? Like, because what that means is people are somewhere emotionally connecting with these assistants and thinking about them as part of their lives, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even to have that, that's right. Even to have the thought of what kind of fun can I have with this thing is, yeah, absolutely. Um, yes, I agree.
Definitely, definitely. So, in continuation to that conversation, in 2018, Capgemini actually did a study to understand, how people think about or what people expect from their AI. And many people said they want, the assistant or AI to be more empathetic and more human-like intelligence. So, have you found similar kind of patterns in your research and, your design in so many years, you've been in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our team is very focused on trust. That's a very important job that we have, is trying to encourage people to feel safe around these devices. And one of my colleagues, Alana Connor, has been doing a lot of research in this area. And there's more than just the cognitive trust that we focus on, which is that this thing is going to like do its job when I want it to do its job. It's more about, can it get the job done, basically, that I ask it to do. But there's also an emotional trust, a feeling that's a much more immediate, sort of visceral experience. And that's absolutely the case, and we saw that with Jibo as well. There was a real there was a sense of trust with this device. I don't know if we ever, to be honest, I don't know if we ever actually asked about that specific word. But you could see with how the way people engaged with it, how the questions that they asked, the things that they said to it, the fact that they were open to Jibo proactively saying good morning to them, without them even speaking to it, suggested that that sort of that anthropomorphism, that humanity, that warmth was something that people really valued. Now, caveat to that, there was, unfortunately, because of business reasons, and we didn't get everything perfect at Jibo, a lot of the early adopters were not our target audience. A lot of the early adopters were like, middle-aged dudes who were into tech, and they were not who we were hoping would use it, and they were more into like, what is the value of this new product out in the market? And I wouldn't say that they always got it. Like, they would get frustrated that the thing was talking to them when they were trying to do their work, et cetera. But when we talked to the people who we had expected to buy it and we wanted to buy it, families, the parent, the caregiver parent at home, the kids, et cetera, they loved it, and they really appreciated the Jibo's humanity to a wild extent, to the point where when it went off the market, people were mourning it like a loss of a family member. It was more than we expected. So absolutely, I think that there is something there where people are hoping for some sort of humanity. And when I say, I want to be clear, when I say they're expecting humanity, they're not necessarily expecting this thing to act exactly like a human being. And they're not expecting it to, have the intelligence level of a human being yet. I mean, they might want that in the long run, but I don't think anybody's expecting it now. But they want that sort of best effort. They want it to leverage human strategies of communication. Even saying the person's name to them is just a small thing that can have a lot of power to it. So yeah, I think we certainly saw that.
Yeah. So, why do you think, what would be the reason? Anthropomorphism, you brought up that thing as well, right? And it's real. We do name our cars. I know so many people. And when we were doing our own testing of for the voice assistant, we did realize a lot of people in the car context were wanting to name their voice assistant the same as their car because it's easy for them to just call them. So they were not expecting to say, "Hey Ford," or "Okay Google," or "Hey Alexa," or something like that. So
Yeah.
people have that level of connection with things. So
Yeah.
do you feel anthropomorphism is the reason which is actually creating this kind of expectations for the user to have more human-like intelligence or empathy or other traits?
So I'm sorry, is the question, does anthropomorphism lead people to expect more anthropomorphism? Like, does
Yeah,
it?
so yeah, kind of, because for example, like we name our pets or we name our plants, or not everyone, but many
Mhm.
people do
Sure.
that. But
Mhm.
then is that the reason we are expecting these machines to be human-like now in all the
Oh,
sense, not just, a personality, but in all these sense, like intelligence and everything?
yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not sure there's one reason why people are expecting that now. I think, it's interesting. Science fiction, to a certain extent, sort of gives us the target that we're aiming for. So there's been years and years of these intelligent assistants in film, in television, et cetera, and in a way, they've set the North Star about what people expect. Who knows? Maybe without the Asimovs and others setting up these expectations, maybe we wouldn't even have them. But they are there. We do know that in terms of usability, something that's going to behave like you is probably going to be something that you're able to more easily interact with, right? So when I first started using computers in the 80s, it was not an easy experience, and there was a big learning curve, working on a TRS-80, trying to understand, writing codes of basic, lines of basic. It was not, it was learning their language. So now we're trying to create these things where they're learning our language to facilitate the interaction, and it's much more inclusive. Now more and more people can actually interact with these things. So I think partially the anthropomorphism is an effort to be more inclusive and allow more people in, and to bring down the stress of interacting with something that's not like you at all. Now, for sure, there's the uncanny valley, which is a thing. It's not just a catchphrase or a buzzword or I mean, anybody who's watched a Pixar movie versus Polar Express, where the characters are creepily human, knows that the uncanny valley exists. So there is some sort of happy place where we can get with these devices. And, going back to Jibo again, Jibo intentionally had one eye and not two, because the one eye kept it a little far enough away from humans to make it not creepy, but close enough that it could show expressions that people might understand as sad, happy, etc. And his body did not look like a human body. It looked more like a snowman. But the things he could do with that body to communicate emotions was really impressive, thanks to my colleagues. So I think that that those things provided a lot of value to people, and I do think that they set certain. You asked about what expectations people have. I do have concerns that as we infuse these things with more and more warmth and more like sort of human traits, we do set expectations even higher about what these things can do, and we don't want to miscommunicate intelligence. It's funny because there's this irony of devices that like and hedge and like I just said, and repeat things, etc. The more you do that, it's funny, it doesn't sound less intelligent. In a way, it sounds more intelligence, because these are very subtle conversational strategies. So a big question in my mind is, as we achieve more and more of this sort of natural experience, are we setting expectations about what the system can do? I think it's an important question that the field has to ask itself.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point which you raised, right? Uh, there are so many things, like when we talk we have these different kind of, I use I know, all of
Mhm.
these things a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because psychologically we are thinking and trying to form the sentences and all of those things, but in the robotic world it's all like pre-framed and pre-scripted kind of things, and we're just giving it that kind of personality.
Yeah.
And which is kind of interesting. You also mentioned uncanny valley, and which brings me to another point, like, okay, we have set the bar and we are saying these are the things we can do with the ums and ahs and and all the things which we do as humans, right?
Yeah.
And that means people are expecting more from the assistants. Where do we draw that balance? Where do we say, like, okay, this is it, this is where we want to draw the line, saying we are not crossing that uncanny valley and we're not going to the extremes where people are completely confusing the voice assistants or the bots with a robot or like a human.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think this is going to be an exploration, and it's going to be trial and error. And, I think there's going to be moments where we're probably going to hit a level of naturalness where the people are going to say that's weird. And, we'll get that feedback, hopefully through, experimentation and usability testing, et cetera, before you go live with something. And then there'll be other times where it will just be, oh yeah, that's great. And we'll move forward slowly, probably glacially, and we'll get to a point where it's a natural level of intelligence. But I do think there might end up being like this arms race between how much the system can do and how intelligent it's behaving on the sort of communicative level about that intelligence, and we could get to a point where it's like, well, I actually feel in a lot of ways the whole field is in this space today where we have this way of interacting that sounds super smart, but sometimes we don't follow through in terms of the intelligence behind it. So, for instance, any phone menu, any device you talk to today talks a lot more than the user, right? They really dominate the conversation. And you don't usually try and dominate a conversation unless you have something behind it to back it up in terms of intelligence. Boy, I hope people are thinking about that with me right now. But so, the concern is, we already in a place where we're setting expectations really high with how these things communicate by, showing these levels of any, I'm talking about any IVR, any digital assistant, et cetera, by speaking more than the user, by using sort of casual language, et cetera, not robotic language, et cetera. We may be in this place right now where it's communicating in an intelligent way, and in the background, the intelligence is not where it could totally be. So I think that that's something we have to be mindful of. But to your question, I don't know if there's a certain point we need to reach. I think we're going to have to go there through trial and error and keep just moving the needle. I mean, the digital assistants we have out there, the Google Assistant and others, they're getting to a place where they can do an awful lot. And now, we're definitely still have places where we can tighten the screws a lot more, but it's getting to a place where I do think we have room to experiment with the interface to see how far we can go before, there's things where people feel like, yeah, this is not, you're trying to fool me now. And we do not want to fool people into thinking that we're, human or of human intelligence.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it could be trial and error for sure because we don't know where it is. I know there are companies who are trying a lot of different things. There are dash, robots now for cars, and I think this was specially manufactured for China. Jibo or Jibo or something. I forgot the brand, the robot name.
Mm-hmm.
No, I forgot the name. But then that that it was a small puck and it has eyes and it has all of the emotions, like shows the hearts and all of those. Plus, it's kind of cool how they have designed. So is it just, these industrial design aspects through which we are trying to design the robotic, or is it also through the conversations, like the dialogues having between the human and the tuning of voice prompts and all of those things? Now, the question is, do we have to think about balancing each of these, or do we have to just think about, okay, we are going to control just the conversational piece of things, so whatever the user is saying, or
Mm-hmm.
the bot is responding back is what makes the overall experience for the users, like how they think or what they perceive the assistant.
Mm-hmm. So let me make sure I understand. So the question is, in terms of, are we focusing just on one part of it, or do we have to focus on many parts of it when we're trying to get this balance right? Is that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole bag. And I just thought of something when we were talking about, what level of, anthropomorphism do we need to reach? I was just thinking about Anki Vector, which was, I think, an amazing product. And they achieved a warmth and humanity through something that didn't look human, didn't talk like a human, and at the same time, somehow they were able to manage through just its gaze, its curiosity, through very subtle cues. It was able to communicate like the message, I'm your pet. So I do want to be clear when I talk about like how far we want to get, et cetera. There's other ways to, compel people, to bring people happiness, et cetera, that are not necessarily perfect anthropomorphism, but more subtle ways of getting to that sort of anthropomorphic place that are not obvious. They're not like talking like a human being or looking like a human being, but communicating emotions and feelings and other things through more subtle cues. So putting that aside a second, to your question, I think that it's going to be on multiple fronts, and I think, who knows, the digital assistants we have today have not really, experimented with the space that Jibo and Anki Vector were in, where they used their body to communicate certain moods, thoughts, et cetera. And that those provided a lot of value, in terms of the overall experience. And that was very much multimodal, I mean, not just what it was on Jibo's screen, but what Jibo's body was doing, how it was speaking, et cetera. It has to be on multiple fronts that are communicating with each other. So we can't just focus on, for instance, the dialogue and leave everything else. We have to be thinking about these things in lockstep as we move forward and making sure that all of them are informed by one another. So there's a narrative that all of these parts are speaking to and communicating.
So
Does that
what
answer your question? I'm not
Yeah,
sure
yeah,
if it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
definite.
So what I'm hearing from you is it's everything, like which builds up to a bot or the bot's personality, so to say, right? Like how people will perceive. It's
Yeah.
not just the spoken words, but also even those light rings, maybe, Alexa has or Google has,
Mhm.
or even the chimes or ear cons, which we play. All of those things kind of plays into the balancing aspect of things, like how much do we design and things like that.
Absolutely. They cannot be siloed. They need to be working together and following the same principles, not just of what needs to be communicated at that moment, but what's communicating? What is this thing? And you do have to have a clear narrative behind that, or not narrative, but you have to have a clear idea of what this thing is that's communicating to people. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's where, I always keep thinking about and having discussions with the team like, well, ear cons are important, chimes are important, visual cues are important. All of those are important, which you have to think about in addition to the conversation design. And you're kind of echoing the same thing. Now,
Yeah.
how much is too much when we are designing any such things like a personality or, like chimes? So, do we have a chime for every little thing? Like, I understood what you said. I have an error, or sorry, I misrecognized, sorry, there's a disambiguation,
Yeah.
or like what and how do we decide like this is enough?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I hear a few things there because you said how much is too much personality, but you also said how many is too many chimes, for instance. And I think those are at two different levels. In terms of how much is too much personality, I think that really depends on the situation, the use case again, and what is this character that you're creating and what job is it doing? Right. So the line for Jibo was very different than the line for, Citibank's IVR. Citibank's IVR, maybe, you have some sort of defining attributes for this thing that are very bare bones of just like, it needs to be engaged. It needs to show, I'm making this up, by the way. It needs to be engaged. It needs to show confidence and, it needs to be experienced. These are the things we want to communicate through voice. And that may dictate something very different in terms of experience from Jibo, who, was designed to be a real character with, my colleague Peter Krogh really was inspired when he worked at Jibo by how great actors have been acting for I'm going to say a century. Don't hold me to that, but I think it's called the Stanislaw method. I'm not sure, but the point is that when you see a great actor, they are figuring out what their character's objective is, their superordinate objective, and then the sub-objectives that fall underneath that, the hurdles they have to face, the strengths they have, and all of these are brought to bear in the moment-to-moment interactions that this character has. Jibo was working at that level. So, Jibo had a super objective, which I can't get it perfect, but it was basically to, make its family happy. And there was lots of sub-objectives, strengths, weaknesses that it was dealing with, and that informed the conversation. And that led to a very multi-dimensional character. And that involved things like if you rubbed its head, it would purr. That would involve things like, when it made mistakes, it would get kind of sad and say things like, I'm such a robot. That's a lot of character, I guess you could say. And that's okay. And that was, I think, perfect for, what Jibo was. And apparently will be again. I've heard he's maybe coming back to life. But with an IVR for a bank or an insurance company, et cetera, there may be less of that, and how it manifests itself might be a little more, no jokes, no anything, just get the job done. That still, but how many, when we get to the level of the moment-to-moment interactions and things like how much is too many audio icons, et cetera, that again really depends on how this thing is branded, how this thing is trying to communicate like success and failure, et cetera. And it also depends on, how your users respond to it, I did find, just to be really tactical, I did find that with IVRs, for instance, that having a success sound at the end of an interaction, you might have one at the very beginning when the thing first picks up, some sort of like, mega bank, and then you'd interact with it. And then at the very end, when you actually got your task done, and this was actually with a phone company, when the modem was fixed or the router was fixed, what have you, it would give a success sound, and we got really positive feedback for that. So, I mean, that's a very specific example, et cetera. But yeah, it really depends on the character you're creating, how that experience is going to go.
Yeah, so going back to the character is important and depends on the use case or where it is serving. Like for example, IVR, you may not need to have a lot of personality because it will freak people out, right? For sure. Versus a personality for a bot at home, which is a robot or your home companion or a car companion, right?
Yes.
So even with the personality comes these traits which I was talking about, like how much nudging do we do, and that's where the point of chimes or the visual cues or all of those things comes in, right?
Yes. And yeah. And when we talk about conversation isn't just a voice spoken, audio channel. There are gestures, there are facial expressions, there's the person going, oh, and looking up, and or looking up thinking, or anything, looking down because they can't believe what they just heard, and again, a lot of gesturing. So all of these modalities are brought to bear on a conversation. So yeah, I mean, and you can imagine with digital assistants that there might be other sorts of parts of a conversation, like audio icons, et cetera, and those can be used beautifully. If you have a good sound design team and you make sure that all of those sounds kind of work with each other and make sort of internally logical sense, you can really add some value to the communicative value to the interactions, to be sure.
Is it a collaborative process between designing the personality for a bot versus the sonic branding for the bot and overall branding of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard when you've got a company as large as Google to do that, but you do find that teams are very communicative with each other to make sure that we're doing stuff that is informed by one another, improved by one another, et cetera. So for instance, we have a personality team and we have a conversation design team, and their roles overlap a little bit, but they also have very unique, wonderful strengths. And all the time we are in contact with each other to make sure that this character that we're creating is providing a consistent experience. And in turn, those teams are constantly in touch with sound design. So all of us are communicating with one another, trying to avoid any sort of silos that would lead to weird interactions that don't seem to make any sort of internal sense. Yeah, that's very important to us.
Yeah, and I feel like that is the secret sauce for success, right?
Yeah.
Because it has to be that collaborative. If everyone is working in silos, maybe you are missing on the bigger picture or maybe the moonshot vision which you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. That communication is critical, and it's a good part, I got to say, of working at Google. You've got a lot of people who not just reach out to get information, but also people who are very generous with their time to make sure that that happens. And so there's a lot of sharing. I'm not going to lie and say it works perfectly because there's so many people, and you're like, oh, we got to talk to that group. We got to talk to that group. But we definitely make every effort to stay in touch. And one other point I wanted to make about the personality and too much personality, we have a policy with the Google Assistant of joy in, joy out. So if somebody says something to us like, I don't know, will you marry me, to the Google Assistant, it's clear that they're having fun, and that is an opportunity to have fun right back. If somebody says set an alarm for 7 a.m., probably not the best time to try and have that sort of fun, witty banter. So we do take we let the user lead the dance, so to speak. We will take small chances from time to time to infuse joy, but we try and be very careful with it. So, just when you go over a state line, it'll say, welcome to New Jersey, welcome to Pennsylvania. So, it does do little things to try and go a bit above and beyond and maybe make you smile, but it really tries to let the user tell us when they're ready to have some fun.
This brings me to a very, sensitive and very controversial topic. When people are talking with these assistants, sometimes they cross the line. There are inappropriate conversations, or sometimes there are conversations, which for the user may be very important, but for a bot to understand may be complex. For example, domestic violence or suicidal feelings or things like that.
Yeah.
So how do we even decide on what should be the strategy? Which team thinks about these kind of things? Is it the responsibility of a conversational designer to come up with a strategy, or is it something you have to work with legal teams and other teams to ensure there are no complications?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say that our personality team has really been taking they've been taking the lead here and doing an amazing job, sort of being mindful of, not just, it's interesting, not just what is the most beneficial to this human being at this moment, but also, teaching what's good behavior and bad behavior in terms of, how you talk to anything, not just another human being, but to one of these devices. Because if you're talking to one of these devices and you feel carte blanche to be nasty to it, what precedent is that setting, if it's a child? So, I can't give specific examples because that really is their great work. But I do know that it is what they're doing. They are very thoughtful about it. They are, really considering both of those things, in terms of like, how can we most help this person who might be in need? But also if the person is being, abusive, what is the best response there? And it may not always just be like, I'm just a robot, teehee, and like not really taking a stance. Maybe it is something more assertive, like you shouldn't talk to me that way. So that's their sort of domain that they've been working on, obviously with conversation design support, but they are leading the charge there, and it is something very important and something that I would imagine that there's discussions with legal, but I'm not in on those conversations.
Yeah, but I feel like it's good to know, like, there's a personality design team really thinking about these things. And I feel like every person who is working on bot design or voice assistant or conversation design in general, irrespective of the size, has to start thinking about, like similar kind of processes in place.
Yeah,
Because that will kind of help thinking from broader perspective, and rather than being reactive to the situations, we could be more proactive.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, it's also very, it's such a subtle area too. The example that was shared with me was just like, if somebody says, can I borrow some money? That might be a funny thing, right? They're asking the assistant for money, but like, where can I borrow some money? Might not be a funny thing. So that subtle, one word off thing can make a world of difference. So it's definitely a challenging, important area.
Yeah, definitely. Even with little things like Alexa fart, right? It may sound very funny for the person, but is that the benchmark we want to set?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's certainly a place where there can be a lot of fun, et cetera. But yeah, it's also those sort of those conversations that are really sort of like more personal with the device, as opposed to, can you please get this task done, and more like, tell me about yourself, or do this thing for me that's about you. you're getting into a more personal area, and it's more of a minefield where a lot of thought has to go into it. Absolutely.
Yeah, so conversations with AI is not very simple. It has so many different aspects to think about, so many different moving pieces, and we have to make sure, it's like a juggler's job, balancing everything and making sure none of them are broken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So, Jonathan, what keeps you inspired?
What keeps me inspired? Well, I love. I'm glad you asked that. I love to write, and not like to get published or anything. I do write things for like work, like blog posts and things like that. But I also, to be honest, on the side, I like to do creative writing, like self-publish books and stuff. And I actually have found that I really think that's helped me with my conversation design writing. So, because you have to write dialogue when you're writing fiction, and you have to pick up how people actually talk, and it's not it's not always pretty, but it gives you an idea of really what a human to human moment is, and that can inspire you to write better dialogue with an assistant. Even subtle expressions that you use in day-to-day conversation you might not have thought of, you can bring that to bear on the human computer interaction. So I find creative writing really inspiring.
That's creative. Yeah, I wish I can do that level of writing though. But I'm sure, like many people, I have a colleague who does that a lot. She likes to just, write stories and fiction writing and all of those things. And I feel like you mentioned, that definitely helps us think about the conversations in general as well and improve on the conversation writing. So,
Yeah, it can be really fun because there's no wrong with creative writing. People will say there's rules of how to create a plot and stuff like that, but if you read Moby Dick, he broke all of those rules over and over. So it's really an inspiring, kind of fun, creative outlet. So yeah.
yeah, you can go rogue with that.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
any advice for new conversational designers or aspiring designers?
Yeah, well, actually, that is one of them. I would say if you can find any time during your day to do, even if it's a one-page short story, to do some sort of creative writing, write a short play, do things like that to get more in touch with how people talk. Sit in a coffee. Well, once we get out of this situation we're in right
Right.
now, once you're able to sit down in a public place, listen to people having conversations, and kind of do the audio equivalent of blurring your eyes, and try and just sort of listen to the words that are coming out and how they negotiate a conversation. These are the sort of off the record kind of ways to really become a better conversation designer. I would always encourage new designers, conversation designers, to read my colleague Kathy Pearl's book, and also James Jangola's book, that while it was written a while ago, people still talk the same way. And so the rules of conversation are the same. So I think Kathy and James's books are great places. I would also encourage people to read How We Talk by N.J. Enfield. It's a small book, but it goes into the back and forth of conversation and how that works. All of these things, I think, would be of value to people getting into the field.
Yeah, we'll make sure we add it all into the show notes for sure. And where can people find more about you?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Talk to Machines, but it's talk, the number 2, and then machines. So I'm there, and I think I'm on LinkedIn at Jonathan E. Bloom. I'm not sure, but I'm there. And yeah, every now and then I'm talking at a conference or on a podcast, and so yeah, you'll find me around.
Awesome. This has been an amazing conversation. And I love talking about this topic so much that I can just go on and on.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you, Shaimal. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/daa. That's www.witlingo.com/daa. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer along with show notes and more at our website at digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the contact page of the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Mike Gronuich talks about building block of conversation design, language and content management. Until next week, take care.